Welcome everyone, my name is Russell and I'll be your host for today's webinar on building locations in Envisioneer. The main topics we're going to cover today are understanding building locations, defining building locations, adding a new building location, and specifying framing options. After we've covered the main subject matter, we will have time for a question and answer session at the end to answer any questions you may have. Please feel free to type in your questions at any point throughout the course of the webinar, and I will address them at the end. So before we get into defining or setting up our building locations, let's talk a bit about what they are first. A building location refers to a specific level or story of a building, for example, the ground floor or foundation level. And as you're going to learn in today's lesson, defining your building locations correctly is a very important part of the design process in Envisioneer. So important that it's the very first thing you should do every time you open a new project in Envisioneer. Why is it so important? Well, building location settings determine all of the following in your project. They determine the relation of each story to grade level or ground level, the heights of your walls, the placement of your floors and your ceilings, the height at which doors, windows, and openings are inserted into your walls, and the framing specifications for your walls. So when you draw walls or insert elements such as doors and windows, they are always inserted on the current building location that you have selected in the View Control toolbar. And down here, as you can see in the bottom left corner of the screen, I currently have the ground floor selected. You can see we have a couple of other options here currently in this project. So let's talk about defining our building locations. So by default, when you open a new Envisioneer project file, there are some preset building locations, and each of these has a predefined settings. So let's have a look at these now by opening up our building locations dialog. To do this, we need to go to Settings, Building Locations. And you can see in this dialog here that opens, here is a list of the predefined building locations for this project. We have a foundation, a ground floor, and a second floor. And you can see there are some associated settings with each of those locations. Before I get into describing each of the individual settings in these columns in the dialog, first I'm going to open up a diagram that's going to help us explain everything as we go through this. So to do that, I'm going to click on this Edit Location button just to open up this diagram here. That's going to help us explain as we go through. So the first column that we have in the building locations dialog box is our number column. So this is where we assign a number to our building locations. We can have up to 999 in any given project, and they'll always be ordered sequentially. The next column you see is the name. We have some predefined names here. You're free to change them at will. And obviously, as you add locations, you can name them whatever you like. In here, our next column here is floor level. So floor level is the height of the top of the floor base above grade or ground level, which is equal to 0. So in this case, for our ground floor, we can see that the preset value here is 1 feet 5.5 inches. And if we come over to our diagram just beside here, we can see that number here. So you can see that the floor level is the height from the top of this floor down to the ground here, which the ground level is 0. So a positive value in this column, as in the case of the ground floor and the second floor, indicates a floor level that is above grade or above 0. And a negative value, such as here for the foundation, indicates a floor level that is below grade. To have a little bit of a closer look at this in detail to explain where this 1 foot 5.5 inches comes from, I'm just going to open up another diagram that I've prepared that will help to explain this. So in this diagram here, we can get a bit of a closer look at what's going on. So first of all, we can see in this diagram, just to review floor level again, for each building locations. So for the foundation level, here is indicating the floor level going from the top of the floor of the foundation up to grade. And for our ground floor, this is our floor level here, going from grade up to the top of the floor of the ground floor. And again, the same principle applies here for the second floor, all the way from grade up to the top of the second floor. So let's get into where this 1 foot 5.5 number here for the ground floor floor level comes from. So there are two things that together make up this value. So the first is we need to look at how high above grade does our foundation wall, which is here, project. So we can see the grade level here, and we can see that our foundation wall holds its head up above, and we can see over here that that value in this case is 6 inches. And then the next item that contributes to this 1 foot 5.5 value is the composition of our structural floor, which in this case for our ground floor we have a 2x6 sill plate, which is 1.5 inches high. We have 2x10 floor joists that sit on the sill plate that are 9.25 inches high. And then on top of our floor joists, we have our 3/4 inch structural sheathing subfloor. So when we add up those three values of 1.5 inches plus 9.25 plus 3/4 inch, we get 11.5 inches. And so when we add this value to our 6 inch value, that's how we arrive at our total of 1 feet 5.5 inches above grade for our ground floor floor level. So we're just going to switch back to Envisioneer, and we're going to have a look at the next item in the building locations dialog box. So the next column after floor level is our head height. And this is the height of the insertion of the tops of our windows and wall openings relative to the floor level. So we can see that value also represented in the diagram over here. So here's the top of our window. This is our floor level. So that's the head height value. The next column is the ceiling height column. And again, we have an indication over here in our diagram of the ceiling height, which is from the top of our subfloor to the underside here of our finished ceiling, whatever that material may be. And then the next column beside ceiling height is our wall height. And again, that has a separate value, and we see that here in our diagram from the top of the wall here to the top of the floor. And you'll note that the wall height is independent of and often different than the ceiling height. And there's a reason for this. It allows for drop ceilings, or if you had strapping between your structural floor on the level above and the finished ceiling for that level. It also can account for any finished flooring material you may add on top of your subfloor. Because as we just learned about the floor level, that this refers to the top of the structural floor, not the finished floor material. And our last column in the building locations dialog, where we have some settings, is the framing options. So this column determines how walls on the building location are framed. So if we wanted to have a look at our framing options, we would double click on this button here in the column. First, I just have to close this dialog, clean up my screen. So when we open up this dialog, you can see here we get another dialog that gives us our location framing options. And just a quick note here is that if you have Pro Architect, you're only going to see 3 of the 5 options available here in this dialog that you're seeing on my screen, and customers who have Building Essentials and Construction Suite would see all of these options. So in this location framing dialog, we have 5 settings. We have our load-bearing span table and non-load-bearing span table, which control the framing of openings in a wall. So if we double-click on either of these, we open up a wall span table library. You can choose from any of the predefined options here, or you could also go in there and create your own span table. The next item is the intersection lookup table here, which contains rules for framing different types of wall intersections. And again, to access the predefined options, you double-click on the list and it opens up a separate dialog where you can choose an option there. Next in our location framing list is our infill configuration. This allows us to control the size and spacing of our stud members, the size and number of our top and bottom plates, as well as whether or not we want to have blocking in our wall framing. Double clicking on this item again opens another dialog, and you can see there again in here are a number of predefined different options for you to choose from, and you can also modify any of these or create your own. And our last option here in the location framing dialog is the framing rule setting. So again, double clicking here opens up a drop-down menu where you can specify which starting point you want to reference for your wall framing, if that's something you need to do in preparing your construction drawings. So now that we've defined the function of each of the properties in this dialog, we're going to have a look at the way they behave and the effect they have on elements in the model. So it's very important to understand that there are 2 different types of properties here in this table. There are interactive properties and independent properties. So first I'm going to explain interactive properties. So these properties will update previously inserted elements when you come back here and change their value in the dialog box. So for example, if you wanted to change the floor level of one of your building locations and you came back in here and raised it by 6 inches, it would indeed raise the height of all previously inserted elements on that location and any higher locations by 6 inches. So floor level is one of 2 interactive properties in the dialog. The other is framing options. So the other 3 properties in here, the head height, the ceiling height, and the wall height, these are all independent properties, meaning that they will not update when you change their value in the dialog box. So if you had inserted a bunch of walls into your model and came back here and you wanted to raise them by 6 inches, coming in here and just changing the wall height by 6 inches is not going to raise the wall height of previously inserted walls. It's only going to apply to any newly inserted walls after you make the change. So now that we've reviewed all that, let's have a look at how this all works in action. Just want to clear up my screen here. So you can see in this example model, I've created some ground floor walls with a front door and a couple of windows on the front facade of the house. And I did this using the default settings in the building locations dialog. So when we look at the property of the walls, for instance, I go in to look at the properties of my walls, and I can see that the height of the walls is 8 feet 1 1/8, as was defined in the building location default settings. Similarly, I put in a ceiling here, and this ceiling has also been inserted at 8 feet. And I have also put in the doors and windows here, and the head height for these is 6 feet 8 inches, which you can see in this elevation here, this 6 foot 8 head height value. The top of the window to the top of the floor, which we see here, the ground floor 1 feet 5 1/2, and the head height is 6 feet 8 inches above that. So everything's been inserted according to the predefined building location settings. But what if I wanted to, now that I've done all this work, I want to change my ceilings to 10 feet high, and I want to change the head height for my windows to 8 feet high to accommodate some taller windows and add a transom window to the front door. So if I now go back to my building location settings and I make all these changes, so I go ahead and change my head height to 8 feet, I change my ceiling height to 10 feet, and also I need to obviously change my wall height to raise it up by 2 feet, and click OK. And you can see I come back here to my model and nothing has changed. Nothing is updated. So this is an example of how independent properties behave. They don't update. Previously inserted elements don't update once you make those changes in the building location settings. So I would now need to go in and manually update all of these elements, which I can do. So I'm going to just quickly do that. So I can go in here and I can update my walls, go in here and manually change their height now to 10 feet 1 1/8 of an inch to match what I had entered in the building locations dialog. I can come in and I can elevate my ceiling up to 10 feet, which is where I want it to be. And you see that that'll move up. Similarly, I can select my windows and I can elevate those up to a head height of 8 feet. And click OK. While I'm in here, I will also go in and replace these windows with the taller windows that I wanted to put in here. So we'll go ahead and do that. And I will quickly change my door. I will add in a highlight above the door, and I will make it 1 feet 4, because that plus the 6 feet 8 of the door is going to also bring it up to 8 feet, so you can see it's in line with the top of my windows. So I can do that. I can come in here and manually make those changes after. But obviously it would be a lot quicker if I had just set my settings from the get-go for the ground floor and come in and done these insertions and would have only had to do it once. So let's put this more efficient workflow into practice for our second floor. So first I need to go back to my building locations dialog and switch to my second floor. And so here I'm going to go ahead and change my head height to 8 feet. I'm going to set my ceiling height to 10 feet. And I'm also going to set my wall height again to 10 feet 1 1/8 to match the ground floor, and go ahead and click OK. So I've now made those changes in defining my second floor building location. So I'm ready to go ahead and put in my second floor walls. So to do this quickly, because they're going to be the same kind of walls and the same height, I'm going to go ahead and select all my walls for the ground floor and then use the duplicate locations option. I'm going to select my second floor target location and click OK. I don't want to delete the original object because I want to keep those ground floor walls, so I'm going to click No. And you can see, there I go, I've got my second floor walls inserted and I already have some windows. Of course I have this door which I don't want here, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And then we'll go ahead and put in a window there in its place. So we'll select a window and we will duplicate that window and bring it over and snap to the middle. We go back to my 3D quick view here and you can see, there I go, I've got my second floor walls in, I've got my windows in my front facade ready to go. So now let's look at what we need to do when we want to add a new location. In this case, let's add a third floor to our house. So we're going to go back to our building locations dialog, and we're going to click on the add location button. And you notice when we click here, we're given two options. We have calculate from existing location or calculate from grade. The second one is the dialog that opened when we were initially reviewing the building location settings. So we've already gone through that, and that will again be covered in a PDF booklet that we'll send out at the end of the webinar. So for this instance, I want to calculate from the second floor, so I'm going to go ahead and leave this radio button selected and click OK here. And you see that opens up this location calculator from existing dialog. And we have a number of fields to complete this dialog that we have to fill out. So the first thing we want to do, of course, is to give it a name. So let's call it third floor. The next thing I want to look at, actually, before we get into our wall height, etc., is to look at our floor. So let's look at our structural floor. So because it's a second floor and the joists are sitting right on top of the framing of the floor below, I'm not going to have a sill plate, so I'm going to leave that value at 0. Next, I'm going to look at this structural field, which would refer to my floor joists. So I'm going to use 2x10s again for this floor, which is actually 9 1/4 inches deep. So I'll type that value in there. And then my sheathing again, just like on the ground floor, is going to be 3/4 inch structural sheathing. And I just want to take a sec here just to point out that you may have noticed that as I entered those values, the value of this floor level field here did go up. And so this field is automatically calculated for you. And it's basically adding up these three values, which in this case is 10 inches, and it's raising it 10 inches up above this top of the wall from grade value here, which is the top of the walls of the level below. So now let's look at our head height, our ceiling height, and our wall height. So in this case, I'm going to choose that I'm going to put my third floor walls, I'm actually going to make those a little shorter. I'm going to only have 9-foot ceilings, let's say. So I'm going to have 9-foot ceiling, 9-foot 1 1/8 walls, and I'll drop my head height down to 7 feet. So again, I just want to point out one other value field here that you may have noticed that changes as I make the changes to all of these items in here. So I'm finished entering all of my values. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And you can see that that has now added this third floor location with all of its settings to our building locations dialog box. So we're ready to go ahead and add in our third floor walls. So let's click OK. So we could manually draw the walls here, or we could also, I suppose, duplicate the walls from the second floor to the third floor. But because our walls on the third floor, we've decided we want them a different height, they would be the wrong height and we'd have to go back and adjust them manually afterwards. So I'm actually going to go ahead and use one of our design wizards to insert our walls. So we're going to use the floor and foundation builder wizard to insert our third floor walls. So this is just a welcome screen, so we're going to click next here. We are going to leave the floor level radio button active, and we're going to choose a third floor location and go ahead and click next. I'm going to choose a cavity type wall because that's the type of wall we're using in this house. There are two other options here. Got to choose my walls, which in this case again I'm going to choose a 2x6 brick wall to match my existing walls, and again I want to choose a floor, and I'm going to choose hardwood flooring for my third floor. I'm going to click next. This pane here gives me the option to make any lateral adjustments in the wall if I needed to. In this case I don't, so I'm just going to go ahead and click next. And finally we come to the finish dialog. So I'm going to click this, go ahead, and you can see, presto, we have our third floor walls. And you can see that we do appear to have a little gap here between the two floors, so that's just a case of going in and selecting these, and we're going to make a quick change to the properties here. We can see that this distance that the lower exterior face bottom extends beyond to cover our structural floor is not the right value, so we're going to change that to 10 inches to match the thickness of our structural floor. And there we go, we've got our third floor walls inserted. So now that we have these 3 levels of exterior walls created for the house, we need to create a foundation to support these walls. So before we do that, let's just go back to our building locations dialog, and let's have a look at the settings for our foundation level. As you can see in this dialog, currently the floor level here for the foundation, the default setting is -7 feet 6, or in other words, 7 feet 6 inches below grade. And the current wall height is set to 8 feet 0 inches. So these default settings would be common for a house with a full basement, which is typical in some areas. In this case, I'm going to change these settings. As the house I'm working on, I want it to have a stem wall foundation to get the footings below the frost line, but not a full basement. But before we go ahead and change these values, I just want to have one more look at our wall detail diagram. So I'm going to go ahead and open that back up. So as we can see, again, coming back to this diagram, the wall height for our foundation wall, which is here, here's the wall height of our foundation wall. And as drawn in this detail, it's going from the top of this slab here to the top of the foundation wall as it projects above grade. And so it's up 6 inches above grade as we looked at before. So this is something we have to take into account when we're calculating our desired wall height as well as our floor level for our foundation. And the other thing to note is because I'm changing the type of foundation from what the default specifies, the default is accounting for the fact that there's probably going to be a concrete slab in the basement, as is shown here in this diagram. There's the slab where I just drew the arrow. There won't be a slab in my project because it's an unfinished crawl space. So this is a very important distinction, because in Envisioneer, when there is no floor slab on the foundation level, this top of floor reference line right here is going to drop down to the top of the footing. So obviously that's going to accordingly change the references for the floor level and for the wall height. So I just wanted to take a minute to point that out so you'll understand the changes that I'm going to make when I go into my building locations dialog. So let's get out of here, clear the screen, get back into Envisioneer, get back to our building locations dialog box. So I want the top of the footing for my building to be 4'6" below grade, which means so I need to change this existing -7'6" to -4'6". And similarly, my wall height is going to be 5 feet tall. So it's going to be that 4'6" below grade plus my 6 inches above grade. The head height and the ceiling height in this case don't really matter on my project because I'm not putting in any windows or a ceiling in the crawl space, so I'm going to leave those values alone in this instance. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now that we've adjusted our settings for the foundation level, we can go ahead and put in our foundation. So I'm again going to use the floor and foundation design wizard for a different purpose. You can see I'm getting this message just because I have to change my building location settings in the view control toolbar so I'm on a level where there are enclosed walls. So let's go back and run this again. Here's our welcome screen again. We're going to click next. In this case, we're building a foundation level. And yes, we are indeed on the foundation, so we'll leave that alone. Go ahead and click next. I am putting in a wall footing type of foundation in this instance. So I need to choose my walls. I'm going to choose an 8-inch concrete poured concrete wall for my foundation stem wall, and I'm going to choose a footing, and we'll do an 8-inch by 2-foot rectangular solid strip footing. Go ahead and click next. And again, this screen here gives us the option to make any lateral shifts if we wanted to. In this case, I'm not going to make any changes there, so I'll go ahead and click next. And again, when I'm all ready to go, I click the finish button. And you can see there that our foundation has been inserted. I'm just going to turn the terrain off so we can see that a little better and zoom out. So you can see we've got our foundation walls and footings inserted for our building. So that's pretty much the end of our active portion of the webinar for today. I'm just going to review a few points. Just going to pull this out of the way and open up our building locations dialog once again for our final review, just so we have that handy as we're going through this. So as you may have learned here, the building locations dialog box is really the most important dialog box in the software. And you should always come in here and set all your settings before you start building your project in Envisioneer, because it's just going to make your work go that much smoother as you're creating your building. So the big points to remember are that the building location settings are going to dictate obviously the number of locations in your project and the name of each. It's going to determine the relationship of different building locations or levels to one another and to grade or ground level, which is equal to 0. It's going to determine the wall and the ceiling heights and the floor heights for your building. It's also going to determine your head height, which is the height at which elements such as doors, windows, and openings are placed into the model. And lastly, here is where you control the framing settings for the walls in your project. And as we discussed at the very beginning, there's two kinds of properties. There are interactive properties such as floor level and framing options. And we know now that when we make adjustments here in the building locations dialog, previously inserted items will update when we change anything in those two columns. Whereas for our head height, ceiling height, and wall height, these are independent properties, and previously inserted items, walls, doors, windows, etc., are not going to adjust when we come in here and make changes. Only things we insert after we make the changes are going to update. So I'm just going to clean up my screen here, and it's now time for our question and answer period. So if you haven't already, please go ahead now and submit any questions you have about building locations, and I'm just going to open up my panel to see if we have any questions that have come in yet. My first question that I have in here is, if I had an exterior deck down 6 inches from the first floor level, would I create a deck name as a building location? So my answer to that would be that yes, you could indeed do that if you wanted to. You could also create your deck on the first floor, ground floor location and just use your elevate command to move that down 6 inches or whatever the difference was from your finished ground floor level. So you have two options. You could do either. We have another question here. Is wall height from first floor level to the top of the double wall plate? And yes, indeed it is. I'm just going to open up that detail. Yeah, so that you can see here's the double top plate and the sill plate. And so our wall height is from the bottom of the sill plate or the top of the structural sheathing of the floor below, which is our floor level, to the very top of the double top plate. So we got another one here. If I have a crawl space with concrete walls and footings, and the crawl space slab is 3 feet below the first floor level, would the 3 feet be a -3 foot or +3 foot designation? So it would be a -3 foot designation. And in that case, if you did have an actual slab poured in your crawl space, the detail diagram that I went through before would remain the same as it would in the case of a basement, a typical basement with a finished slab. I'm just going to scroll through our list of questions here to see if there's any more new questions coming in. It doesn't look like it at the moment. I'm just going to leave the webinar open for one more minute to see if any more questions come in. And just a reminder that once the webinar is complete, we will be sending out an email with a PDF booklet recapping all the information that we covered today. And within 24 hours, we will post a link in the webinar archive section of our website, so you can always go back there and watch it again. And I'm just seeing to see if there's any last minute questions coming in here. One last question is, if I change a building location, will it automatically update the model? So just come back into my main screen here. Let's close this dialog. So again, this is basically the difference between interactive and independent properties. So if you were to change your floor level or the framing options, any previously inserted options will change. And whereas with the head height, ceiling height, and wall height, anything related to those previously inserted items would not change. So any changes you make in these three columns will not update things already inserted in the model. The framing options you can change later, and your floor level you can change later. So if I decided, for instance, I wanted this third floor level to now be at 25 feet, let's say, and I go ahead and click OK, you can see that that did indeed raise up the floor level of my third floor automatically in the model. Let's come back in and check and see if there's any more last minute questions coming in for today. It looks like that's the end of the questions. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. Hope that it was helpful. Thank you for attending, and we will see you next week.